It is impossible to know everything about anything, and thus we remain perpetually curious and perpetually novice.
This is our flag and our mascot, Franklin. The lightning bolt represents the receipt of knowledge, the enlightenment of illumination, the resonance of truths understood. It awakens us and excites us and makes us hungry for more. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, industrial designer Joey Roth. Joey designs products to articulate the beauty of everyday rituals. He combines simple functionality with honest, unfinished materials that become more personal as they take on a pattern of use. Roth's first two products were the Sora Pot, a minimalist teapot, and the ceramic speakers. With that, Joey Roth.
All right, well, thank you very much for having me. And as Tobias mentioned, I'm an industrial designer. The difference in how you might understand that term is that I've never studied industrial design, and I've never had a client or worked for a design studio. My interest in product design and bringing new physical things into the world is more my way of sort of engaging with, how people can be humans through what they use. In college, I studied psychology and anthropology, and through writing papers and going to lectures, I sort of realized that a better way to explore how people deal with other people and deal with the environment is through creating things and see how people use them. So my real joy in being a designer is coming up with an idea, and when it's in that ideation phase, it's completely in my head, completely controlled by me. But then once I release it into the world, I can really see how other people interact with it, and that's the point at which the design comes alive. So the reason I got into design in the first place, instead of just staying in sort of academia and studying anthropology that way, is I sort of realized that the way you can find out the most about how somebody sees things is by seeing what they use and what they consume. And this started really, really early on. Like, as soon as somebody cracked the first rock and made a spear tip, somebody else was also carving a rock into an animal. And so from the very early stages, designs were split into tools and into ritual objects. And that dichotomy has really stayed with culture up until this day. You look at what a designer does, and you can very clearly determine, are they designing something to make things easier for people or more interesting for people? My interest with my products is spanning that gap, because most human actions that people take don't fit clearly into ritual or function. They're sort of in between. Like when you shake somebody's hand, or you say hello to them, or you ask them what's up or how they're doing, that's both a ritual and a functional action. It's a practiced, kind of agreed upon way of greeting somebody, but it lets you open up a conversation with them. That's a really simple example, but kind of getting more into it, not enough objects span that gap. Too many things are clearly designed for ease of use as the goal, or designed having beauty or making a statement as a goal. And I always try to make things that sort of take a functional pursuit into more of the ritual realm. So I guess before I go further, I'll talk about what I mean by a ritual. The definition of a ritual is a set of practices that have more symbolic meaning than functional use. So when you think of ritual, a lot of people think of religious rituals, or they think of coming of age rituals that a lot of societies have. The way I think about a ritual is something that you do every day, and it gives you more than the product of whatever those actions produce. So say you cook your breakfast in the morning. The easiest way to nourish yourself in the morning would be to eat a power bar or to make an instant shake or something. But a lot of people like cooking in the morning. So the function of nourishing yourself is somewhere between ritual and functional act. And those are the experiences that I'm really, really interested in designing for. And like I said before, when I tell people that I'm an industrial designer, most people think that I try to make things, I optimize things to be as easy to use as possible. I think that in some realms, that's definitely a good goal for designers to have. Like if you're designing medical equipment or anything to do with emergency response or weapons or anything to do with life and death, you definitely want to design it to be as easy to use as possible. And a lot of the designers who I know work in that area, and it is really cool to see them try to shave off as many like milliseconds as possible in terms of how something is accomplished. Because with a product like that, it's really just about an intention and the desired effect. You want the object, which is like a middleman in that situation, to disappear from the interaction as much as possible. With what I do, it's more about making the object known in a fun or interesting way. So with the teapot, for example, using this is definitely not the easiest way to make tea. The easiest way to make tea is buying powdered Lipton or whatever kind of powdered tea you want to use, nuking some water in a cup, and adding in the powder and stirring. That takes a lot less time than this, a lot less energy. But that's clearly not the point of making tea, if you ask most people. Tea is about stopping for a second, engaging in something with your body, if you've been engaging with stuff online or on a computer all day, and having some time to just do a very simple task. And that was the inspiration for designing this teapot. The way that it works, you just open it up, you put the tea inside this glass thing, and then you close the filter right over the top. That snaps back into place, and then you watch as the leaves brew. This design, when I first brought it out, it got a lot of blog coverage, and the majority of comments from people were just total wondering why I would design something like this. You know, it's so much slower than a lot of the ways people can make tea, even loose leaf tea nowadays. It's it's relatively expensive to make because this investment casting takes so much handwork. And it's just a slow way of doing things. And I think when people think of product design, think of industrial design, they think of speeding things up. And they think of how can we make the interaction as invisible, cognitively invisible as possible so that somebody just gets from desire to result with as little interaction. And when now I think people are, combining design and art more, but when I first started realizing what industrial design was, it was all about ease of use. So when people saw this thing, they were just wondering, why don't you put a filter in it? Why don't you make the thing spring-loaded? Why not make it out of plastic instead of metal? It'll be much cheaper and faster. And, responding to those comments and realizing that that's not what I wanted to do sort of started solidifying my philosophy on how I want to design things. I think there's tremendous value in having an object that kind of speaks back to you as you're using it. Doesn't disappear from the interaction, is there, makes itself known, but the designer has to be extremely careful making sure that the things that are noticed are the things that are good about it. And the things that are annoying, those are the things that need to be silenced as much as possible. And through later iterations and through a lot of feedback I got, I'm working on silencing those annoying things with the design. But the idea that a design needs to silence everything, I think works in some fields, but really works in relatively few. People ask me sometimes, it's not just medical and tactical and these kind of life or death devices that should be made as easy to use and as fast to use as possible. What about a vacuum cleaner or something that you don't really care about doing, you just want to get through your day? I think even in those situations, unless it's seriously like seconds matter in terms of saving somebody's life, you can design something like a vacuum cleaner to take a little bit more time to use, but to be so much more satisfying to use. And people aren't really exploring that yet. And I'm not really on the level of vacuum cleaners, but I'd love for somebody to try. You could easily make a game out of a vacuuming thing that connects to your iPhone, and you're vacuuming the floor, and there are different virtual objects on the floor, and you need to collect them in a certain amount of time, and they're moving as you're vacuuming, and you need to go for it. And it might take a little bit more time to clean up your floor, but the time will be time that is enjoyable, and the experience of vacuum cleaning will take on a whole new meaning. So getting back to the whole idea of ritual, I think this is not, I'm not still studying anthropology, and I'm not up on the latest scholarship on this, but I think probably part of the cultural utility of rituals is something like that. Something like making things that have to get done more rich, not just more enjoyable, but more rich, so that the knowledge of doing those things can be more easily passed on. When society didn't have instruction manuals and didn't have easy ways to transfer information between time and between space, ritualizing that information was almost like a codec that you could pack all this info into, and then if another town that was a member of the same culture practiced those rituals, they almost had the codec built in so they could then unpack it. It really let information be packed into a smaller, more easy to understand set of metaphors that can then be unpacked and put into action somewhere else. And I think that really, holds true to today. When I think about designing something new, I try to think of what metaphors am I triggering, or what cultural shared cultural meanings am I triggering by using certain things. The teapot, it wasn't as much of a challenge because teapot design is like chair design. You could do anything with it, and if it holds hot water and has a spout, it's a teapot. So not as much going on there. But with the speakers, there is such an aesthetic associated with electronics nowadays. For some reason, no matter what the electronic device does, people seem to think it needs to be optimized for wind resistance. Like, you design the thing in a wind tunnel, and it needs to have like the curves and the aerodynamic properties to be able to travel with as little drag as possible at like 200 miles an hour. And I think Apple's been part of like the solution and the problem to that. They have certainly challenged that expectation with some of their stuff, but they've also modified it, and now there's sort of a new expectation of stuff looking like Apple things. But with the speakers, I really wanted to break from that and to think about what are people doing when they're listening to music, and what materials will be appropriate to that time of listening to music. The other thing that I was thinking about are people usually buy headphones nowadays. Buying speakers is like a special purchase. Definitely the easiest way to listen to music is to buy a pair of headphones and plug it into your MP3 player or plug it into your computer. I mean, I didn't have speakers on my computer until I designed these because it didn't make sense. Having speakers is good if you have people over or if you have a stereo system, but just listening to music, MP3s that you downloaded, you're going to use headphones. So designing speakers was sort of placing that expectation that you're going to be thinking a bit more about listening to music. It's not going to be something you're doing while you're working or something you're doing as you walk from the Max to your job or riding your bike or whatever. So knowing that people are going to be sitting down and thinking about their music, I wanted to use materials that were as furniture-like but also warm and sort of like slow down as possible. That's why I chose the Baltic birch and the porcelain for the stands, and both of them are handmade, which is kind of weird for speakers in this price range nowadays. The Baltic birch was CNC cut for a while, but the edges were not nice, so now they're cut. The ceramic shell is actually thrown on a wheel in a workshop that makes vases usually, and I'll actually pass this guy around so you can see it. Yeah. And then the back, there's a cork that holds the binding posts in. So these are pretty weird materials for making a small like desktop speaker system, and I really intended to challenge what people thought of as electronics. With the amplifier, the main thing I wanted to kind of question is the idea of these super aerodynamic injection molded objects being mainly things that just sit on your desk. So I wanted to make this as monolithic and sort of immobile looking as possible, because an amplifier is just the thing that sort of anchors a speaker system. It should look heavy, it should be heavy, it should not move that much, and it should be really simple and really monolithic. So that inspired the design of this. This one's a little heavier. So again, going back to how there's always a dichotomy between tool and ritual object. I think that the cool thing about that is that tools often become the ritual object because they're so valued in a society. There are lots of examples of like swords, especially like weapons and farm tools seem to be mainly the tools that become ritual objects. And there's no better example for Western culture, at least, than the crucifix. I mean, the crucifix started as a tool and became like the ritual object. But it doesn't usually go the other way. You don't usually have like a statue that somebody uses to plow their field eventually because they really like the statue. Part of what I'm trying to do with my designs is taking some of the aspects of ritual objects, which are the materials that they use, sort of materials that seem impractical at first but really do make a lot of sense once you see how the object is resolved. And also the kinds of uses that ritual objects are put towards, usually contemplation or reverence or sort of a focal point for meaning, and applying those to tools that are meant to be used every day. So I think that throughout history it's really been tools being elevated to ritual objects, but there are a lot of possibilities when you take aspects of ritual objects and apply those to tools. And I think that's elevation both ways. I mean, something you use every day becomes an intense part of your memory of that time when you're using it, and it definitely affects your day-to-day experience. So that's one of the things I like the most about design, is really, placing this sponge for memory and sponge for meaning inside people's lives who decide to use it, and hearing back from those people is one of the most gratifying things about what I do. So in terms of where I want to take this sort of line of thinking in the future, I think that the whole idea of performance is becoming more and more interesting to me. Like with the teapot, I spent a lot of time optimizing the spout so it wouldn't drip, but I didn't spend as much time optimizing like material use and how little material I could use for it to accomplish the same shape. I didn't spend as much time thinking about production. I mean, I really learned industrial design on this teapot. But with the speakers, I worked with a sound engineer to really get the best sound I could out of it. And the shape of the shell was dictated by basically calculations he did with this really cool computer program on how you can make the shell a waveguide and use the cork to sort of eat any sound waves that weren't doing what they were supposed to do. I don't totally understand that, but it was really cool to have that conversation inform the design as much as it did. So designs I'm working on now, I'm really starting with performance and utility as the go point, and then trying to see when people use this, how can I make that use more interesting, or how can I articulate what is so attractive about this activity? How can I do that through the design of the object? And that's sort of what I mean by, the title of the talk, Articulating the Beauty of Everyday Rituals. I think well, first of all, everyday ritual is kind of a contradiction based on what I said before. I think that, when I said ritual is something that it's a set of human actions that is performed more because of the action's symbolism than because of what the actions accomplish. That is something you could do every day, but that's not exactly what I mean by everyday ritual. Everyday ritual, I mean more an everyday task that's been ritualized. So when you're making tea, for example, you can make tea every day as sort of your caffeine start in the morning, or just a refreshment that you have at work, and not really think about the tea leaves opening, not really think about what you're doing as much. Making tea can become a lot like getting to work or going to the bathroom or any of these things that you do every day. So just an everyday process. But to make it an everyday ritual, it really takes on some of the aspects of rituals, which are performed more for meaning. So this is an everyday ritual. The way that I'm using it as a guide for my designs is something that you perform every day because you want to get something out of it. But that end product, the tea or the music or whatever it is I'm designing for, is not the whole story. The whole story is that layered underneath this meaning that's attached to it. And that meaning is cool because its starting point is my intention as a designer, but the final meaning is always a conversation between my intention and what the user brings to it. So the speakers for one person are going to evoke memories of this crazy party they had right after they got them, and they plugged them in and they were playing music through them. And more than thinking about what was Joey's intention when he designed these, or thinking about the shape of the shell, they're going to think about that party that they had and the fact that the speakers were a part of it. And that's nothing I can control, and that's really cool. For another person who has the exact same object made by the same people in the same factory, they're going to have a completely different meaning. And any object could have that. The drill press over there can be involved in some event that they have here, hopefully in a good way. And then that drill press would have a meaning beyond I can drill holes or sand things on it. But when I design my things, I really try to design that with that in mind, with them taking on the user's meaning. And that goes beyond just the shape and how I want people to use them. It's also in the materials that I choose. One of the things I really, really don't like about a lot of design, especially electronics design, is that the second you take it out of the package, it looks crappier and crappier with every day that passes. Like, a new phone or new MP3 player or any electronic device you get will never look as nice and never be as beautiful as the day you take it out of the package. That's really sucks, because it almost develops like a guilt that people have, destroying this thing that was pristine at one time, and then through their clumsy use or misuse, it's become broken and scratched and all this stuff. I mean, some people have sort of flipped it, and it's like a point of pride to have your iPhone screen with a giant crack on it. But the iPhone is clearly not designed to look good with a crack. I want to design stuff that does look good better when it's abused or dropped or, just used every day by the person. With a Sauropod, to get this shiny surface on it, the easier way to do it would have been just to chrome the metal. But chrome looks really, really bad once it starts to chip off. It doesn't work. So I worked with the manufacturer to figure out how the stainless steel itself could just be polished up to a very high sheen. So it's the surface I want, but as this is used, the part that you grip, which is right here, will actually become shinier because you're always rubbing the oils from your hands on it, and the part that you don't touch but that's in contact with tea will become gradually more matte over time. So after using this thing for 3 or 4 years pretty consistently, you're going to have a gradient where it's really shiny where you grip it, and then where you make the tea, it's going to become more and more dull and matte. And that endpoint, or that endpoint in development, is what I had in mind when I selected the materials and I made the shape. I really wanted it to be a gradient from top to bottom based on how you hold it and how you use it. Having that sort of patina and wear built into the product, makes it even more a sponge for memories, because this thing that started as the same thing as they left the factory becomes individualized and completely unique based on how you used it. The speakers are kind of similar in that you're not going to be touching them as much, but the drivers that I chose, they do break in over a course of 30 hours of music being played. So it does change over the course of, the early course of time that you're owning them. But just the materials that I used are not materials that are going to lose a finish or become chipped or in any way look worse, except for the speaker cone cracking, but I replaced that. In any way look worse than when you took them out of the package based on wear and tear. And I think that physical connection to memories being sort of formed around these objects is just as critical as the designs themselves. Sort of the counterpoint to that, to designing things that want to last a long time, is my approach to packaging design, which is that it should disappear as quickly as possible. Packaging is not something most people, want to keep around as long as the product, unless it's like a gift box, and the box is as much the point as anything. But even those boxes that people kind of venerate, for Japanese pottery, where the wood is lined up, the grain matches at a certain point, and it's tied with a really beautiful string, those were originally designed to be disposed of. The pottery was supposed to last for a really long time, and the boxes, because they're made of paulina, were not supposed to be around as long. So packaging presents for me like another really cool challenge because I want it to, first of all, protect the object, but also be really beautiful when you encounter it. But I want that beauty to be ephemeral, and I want you to be able to toss this in your backyard on your compost pile and for it to be gone in a month. So for both products, I used basically egg crate material, paper pulp, and surrounded it with corrugated cardboard that's held together using a lactose-based glue so that it'll decompose in a month or so. It'll get really soggy and just sort of melt into the ground and be eaten by all kinds of little organisms. And that, I think that, contrast between my goal for packaging design and my goal for the products themselves allows me to do both sides of it and not just design things that I want to be around for years and years and years. So, the reason I do product design in the first place is my way of sort of engaging with how people act in the world. And the really cool thing about observing people with my objects is that they all use them differently and have them set up differently, and I love getting pictures of people with their teapots in their kitchens or their offices and people having their speakers set up with pictures of their friends and everything. And I think that like intense control in the beginning of the process where I determine everything about the design and then I send it to the manufacturer and we go back and forth, but it's just sort of my world in the beginning, and then completely releasing that control once the product is in the world really encapsulates what I love about design. So yeah, that's it. Yeah.
I'm assuming these are more entrepreneurial projects where there's not a client, that you're putting them out in the marketplace.
Yeah, that's right.
When you start, do you have a particular market or customer, or do you speak to people or have any feedback from potential customers out there to get their input from this, or is it basically what you want to put out there and just direct it that way?
Usually when I come up with a new product, and I'm working on a couple of possible ideas now, it's really based on what my obsession is at that time. Like I really latch on to certain things and I just start reading forums online and talking to people in that kind of community. And the really cool thing about the internet is that it gets you to like the nerdiest edge of whatever thing you're interested in at the moment. So, for the teapot, I was really into tea before I released this, and I was like on tea forums, and I took a trip to China and like looked at all these teas and everything, and that was sort of my, it was fun for me. That was just feeding my obsession, but it was also kind of a form of market research.
Do you say, okay, I have this design, I'm going to make 10 of them, 100 of them, 1,000 of them? Do you even consider that?
Well, the way that I sort of test it and try to predict if it's going to be successful or not, I usually throw together some renderings and ask a couple of people whose opinion I really trust, like, do you think I should go forward with this? What things would you change? So that's like the first line. And then if I'm happy with that, I usually release the renderings to a couple of design blogs, and the feedback from that is usually a lot more. And then by then I have a pretty good sense if this is going to be something that makes me money or not. And if I determine that it is, then I bring it into the production process. And the cool thing about doing it that way is that I can pay for most of the production through pre-orders. And that really frees me from having a client to deal with or having investors. And really it's just, as much as possible within the manufacturing constraints. It's my vision.
Is any of this going through traditional retail then?
Yeah. Both of them are in actually right over there, Alder and Co. on Alder and 12th Street is where they're sold in Portland, and then some other stores. I mean, I started just selling online, but I think through that retailers started contacting me, and over time it's been in a couple of them. So. Yeah.
What do you think needs to be redesigned that we use every day?
Well, I think the vacuum cleaner I mentioned, I think there's a lot of missing potential there. But I think that a lot of, moving to Portland, I've gotten like really into outdoor stuff all of a sudden. I was never into that when I lived in Brooklyn. And I always thought that was like the lamest, like carabiners and bright colored nylon stuff. I just wasn't into it. But I think that there again, there's tremendous opportunity to use like the most cutting edge engineered fabrics and, waterproof things but make them constructed in a way that doesn't suck, and using colors that don't stand out when you're in the woods, and actually looking at what it is to be in the woods and designing for that instead of designing like toned down versions of what mountain climbers are using. So I think that there's tremendous potential there.
Where do you see the potential for ritual where there is none right now?
Well, I think that everywhere you look, there's some kind of ritual, and I think that more what I do, there's definitely a tea ritual. I mean, that's like one of the things that comes up when people think of rituals. But with music too, there's this whole audiophile culture, and I think more than trying to create a ritual where there is none, because there's rituals anywhere you look. It's more redefining what the ritual is and realigning it to be more relevant, or just more relevant to other people who aren't attracted to it right now. So areas, again, like I said, like backpacking and hiking, I think there's huge potential. I think that, I think that office stuff, like stuff you have on your desk, like office sets and things, they're still designed for when people were primarily dealing with paper documents, like desk lamps designed to illuminate a paper document on your desk. I think there's a lot of potential designing a desk lamp that's designed to reduce eye strain when you're looking at a screen, or flip from one to another. Yeah, I think it's really just looking into areas that are so agreed upon by our culture that you don't even see that they're metaphors anymore. You just think, oh, office, it's a desk lamp, it's a pencil holder, it's all this stuff. And going back and thinking, what are people actually doing here? How can it be made to be more interesting, or even more functional than it already is?
So I was thinking about my bicycle, how I ride this thing, and it's a real functional object. And it used to be, years ago, I used to be sort of dissatisfied with the fact that I had to clean the chain regularly, and but now it's actually kind of like it's a ritual I go through to clean the chain. It's a nice satisfying experience to get it degreased and glued up right and everything.
Yeah.
But the irritating points, there's some irritating points in that process, like the rear derailleur. I can't always get the stuff out of it. So would you say that like eliminating those irritating points on an existing product would be part of this approach to design that you're talking about?
Well, it's interesting. It's a super fine line, and it's really hard to separate irritating from interesting. I mean, that's like, that's where the good designers are separated from the great, brilliant designers. It's like, I think that a little irritation is kind of good. It's like, I think of music, like the most easy to listen to music sucks, but everyone has a different activation threshold, like some people like harder stuff, some people like sort of interesting stuff. It varies from person to person. So I can only design for myself. I'm not good at predicting what other people are going to think is irritating or not irritating, but I mean, that's a really good example. It's hard to systematically go through and eliminate irritation points while keeping the interesting stuff, because it's like it's like a noise filter in Photoshop. If you get rid of enough noise, you lose detail. So you really have to get that slider right at the right point for what you want to accomplish. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Since you're somewhat new to Portland and you're working with packaging materials, I'm curious, maybe you covered this and someone missed it, but is it made with recycled materials, your packaging materials, or is that something you're not interested in?
No, the pulp is 100% post-consumer, and then the cardboard is not 100%, it's some percentage. But I always strive with anything that's going to be ephemeral and go away. I want it to be as silent as possible in terms of material use or taking up space even. So.
Is there a way that people can just send it back and then you can reuse it? Is that?
I don't have the infrastructure for that right now, but what I encourage people to do is reuse it to transport the object if they're going to be moving it, since it's pretty easy to repack the stuff, or to just throw it in their yard, or if they live in an apartment, break it into little pieces and put it in the compost, because it'll go away pretty easily then. Yeah.
Just on that subject, I think it's interesting that you have such a hard line in the sand when it comes to packaging and sort of adhering to the cradle-to-cradle philosophy, and then you kind of think of your product as being more cradle to grave.
Yeah.
And have you thought about, I don't know, I'm just kind of interested why they're separate, or if you've ever thought
Right.
about how to apply the cradle philosophy to your products.
No, definitely. I mean, it's something that I think about a lot. Basically, if the packaging were cradle to grave, it would be a much shorter span between cradle and grave. Like, I designed the products to last as long as possible and to not become obsolete. With the speaker system, I actually made some decisions about not including a digital connection and not tying it to any current technology, just being able to be totally analog and amplify anything at any point down the road. Because, I mean, my dream is to see these things in an antique shop in 50 years, like still valued, clearly well cared for, but showing signs of use. And I think that sustainability goes, you can approach it in one of two ways. You either make the thing, like the packaging, as disposable as possible so that it, not disposable like encouraging people to throw it away, but as decompostable as possible so that it just decomposes, it's as if it were not there. Or you could design something that is durable, both physically and in terms of being valuable many years down the road, so people won't want to replace it or won't want to throw it out. So with the products, I go for, long-term durability, not wanting to get rid of this thing. And with the packaging, I go for make it as, silent as possible in terms of that stuff. Yeah?
You're stressing this fact of ritualization. Have you ever thought of doing religious type of products, non-secular items, that sort of have that built-in ritual? That's the whole point of the object.
It's not...
I'm not giving you any particular, but anything religious. I'm saying, but religious type of items that are made specifically to have that ritual.
Huh. I never really thought of that before, but I'm trying to think now. It could be really interesting because I'm literally approaching like something that is already very explicitly ritualized and trying to apply some of this stuff.
It seems that the end user would appreciate it a little more, and I'll use the term fetish to fetishize the object. Which ritualization sort of approach that. And I don't need to be condescending in any way to say religious items are that way, but
right.
I think those type of items that are practiced and used somehow inherently have those characteristics that you want them to have those qualities that you're talking about. It seems like there may be a great deal of acceptance to use your philosophy in those type of objects.
Yeah, I've seen designs, posted on the blogs or in magazines where people have taken like a gravestone and applied kind of modern design thinking to it. Or
that gravestone is a fairly inanimate object. I mean,
right.
There are chalices and religious icons and things of that nature that all religions use.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's definitely, it would be an interesting problem to try to solve. I think that because I'm not trained as an industrial designer, and there are a lot of things that industrial designers know that I don't know, and they have a lot more flexibility than I have in terms of being able to design a wide range of objects, and my process is more, I become fixated on a certain thing.
Because I think your objects are very precious, and I think religious type of objects tend to be precious in themselves. And the idea of having that sort of patina built on by usage and caring for would be advantageous for that.
Yeah, I guess I don't really know. Thinking of religious objects, I'm not sure what I could improve on in that way. I think of some of those objects, these relics, or even, religions are all based on objects, but I don't know how it could.
Part of being a designer is you research, you go into an institution, you go into a gift shop or something like that. Certainly online, you could just type in religious objects and you get a million hits.
Yeah, no, for sure. It'd be an interesting thing to explore. Yeah.
Do you have any rituals in your life that you really enjoy, and are there any objects that you personally are tied to that maybe had an influence on the stuff that you made?
Yeah, definitely.
Any stuff you like doing and stuff you like using while you're doing it?
Yeah. The thing I always think of when I think of other objects that sort of behave the way that I hope my objects will behave is when I moved to San Francisco 2 years ago, I got really into longboarding, and I borrowed a friend's longboard before I actually tried it, and there's this like path in this park called the Panhandle, which is like this long, narrow park, and it was good because there were no cars on it, and I could just practice and fall and do all that stuff. But there were eucalyptus nuts everywhere because the park was covered in eucalyptus trees, and so the road was covered in eucalyptus nuts, and when I was practicing, I'd often hit a eucalyptus nut and go flying and eat a lot of pavement. But the cool thing is the eucalyptus nuts had this oil that was so strong that the scent of that eucalyptus nut oil on the longboard's wheels sort of represented in a way like my improvement and the falls that I took and just sort of my progress. Like the more eucalyptus smell on these wheels, sort of the more my progress bar with learning how to skateboard had gone forward. So that like unintentional feedback loop, that changing of a physical object that represents something that I did, is like totally what I go for in my designs. I don't think I could do it that well, is that unintentional interaction, but that's it.
Yeah. Cool.
So, yeah. All right. Well, thanks very much, guys. This is fun. And if you want to come over to the table and look at this stuff, please feel free.
All right. Well, thanks everyone so much. Thanks again to Joey Roth.
Thank you.
That was awesome. This is the final meeting for 2010. Stay tuned for next year. Our speakers will be Nathan Berge, an open source rocket scientist, Phil Fell, who will be speaking about the relationship between artists and their respective governments, Aaron Lacoma, who's an expert upholsterer, Michael Felix from FLO, who's going to be talking about his bicycle synthesizer. So it's going to be awesome. Thanks so much for coming, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm Ken.
Hey, nice to meet you.
I had a question.
Yeah.
I always looked at your work, and I was interested in how focused it was.
Yeah.
Very few products. And me and my crew, we're always like a million ideas, which I'm sure you do.
Yeah.
How do you focus your energy?
Yeah, well that's like seriously 40% of my work is figuring out what not to do. And it's really, I have to be so careful in what I release because I'm if I like flop, what I'm doing is so wrong. So, you know, I didn't really talk about this, but I take a really long time to release new products, and I go through asking friends, I make a prototype, I bring it around to people I trust.
I actually have an opening in January and it's
really work. And most of it is just one instant.
And I think January 11th is good, and then it would be like the 25th of January.
You know, otherwise
I don't know what your availability. Wow.
Tabs on
That is
culture,
awesome.
it's a culture that I'm interested in. So
What's your
and
availability?
just ask myself, like, am I willing to invest
Availability
savings in this right now? So it's worked out so far for the two products in the poster that I did, and I just try to apply that same kind of protocol.
Another big question.
I'll send you an email tomorrow, and we'll just talk about it.
Yeah.
That'd be
I don't either. Totally awesome.